Welcome, friends, to a gathering place for the curious and the brave. Do you ever feel a shiver run down your spine on a perfectly ordinary day? Does the rustle of leaves in the wind sometimes whisper secrets in your ear? We delve into the realm of the unexplained. These are true stories, whispered through generations, passed down from campfire to campfire, each one abrush with the unseen. So settle in, adjust the lights, and prepare to be chilled. Tonight, we share true scary stories.
A couple of years ago, when I was in college, something scary happened to me as I was playing video games. Many nights, if I didn't have homework, or even if I did have homework for that matter, I would play video games in my room. I lived in a small house with one other roommate that we rented together. The house was older and somewhat run down. There were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs, and a living room and kitchen downstairs. That was basically it. I met my roommate Kevin in the dorms the previous year. We lived across the hall from each other, and also had a couple of classes together. We became pretty good friends, and it worked out well for us to rent the house together. I remember that semester. We also had a class together as well. Other than that, our schedules were a bit different though. We would be gone at different times of day sometimes, and with school it could get pretty busy on the schedule. One night, after a long day of classes and homework, I decided to unwind and play some Call of Duty. The time was about 9 p.m. or so, and it was dark outside. I had been locked away in a room for at least the past 3 hours, trying to get my assignment done. Thankfully, I had been able to finish it. I put on my headset and started gaming. I played a few rounds, but I remember that in between one of them, I thought I could hear a banging on my door. My headset didn't allow me to hear very well, because it covered my ears entirely. While I was playing, there was no chance I was hearing anything. Now, after hearing someone banging on my bedroom door, I assumed it must be Kevin. I took off my headset to hear the tail end of it. Before it stopped, I told Kevin to come in, but he didn't. Whoever was on the other side didn't even answer me. After a few seconds, I got up from my chair and walked over to the door. When I opened it, I did not see Kevin out in the hallway. Actually, no one was there at all. I walked over to Kevin's room, still thinking it was him who had knocked, because who else would it be? I knocked on his door, which was closed, but he didn't answer me. I thought about just walking into his room, but decided that might not be the best idea. Maybe he had gone downstairs or something. I walked downstairs and checked all around the house, but Kevin was nowhere to be seen. I figured he must be in his room. I went back to my bedroom and sat down at my chair to continue playing the game. I played Call of Duty for the next 30 minutes or so. I was right in the middle of a round when for some reason I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. My TV and gaming chair that I was sitting on were in the right corner of my room. Directly to the left on the other side was the bedroom door. It seemed to be moving. Of course, I couldn't hear anything due to my headset being on. I looked over and saw my bedroom door slowly opening. It was extremely slow and deliberate, and it really creeped me out. Outside of my room, it was pitch black because all the lights were off. We often kept them off to save on the electricity bill. I could just barely see the part of someone for just a second before they moved away. My door was now open 3 or 4 inches. It had been completely closed before. I got the chills from seeing this. I was hoping it was just Kevin, but I had a bad feeling it was not him. I picked up my phone and sent Kevin a message asking him if he was home. He responded almost instantly, saying he was at the school gym working out. My creeped out feeling got 10 times worse. Somebody was in our home, and I didn't know who or why. My mind started racing. I was afraid the person inside might be dangerous. I couldn't bring myself to leave my room. It seemed like a big risk to me. I had no kinds of weapons or anything. I told Kevin about the situation and he said that I should leave if I could. I was on the second floor though, so that was going to be difficult. After several minutes of sitting in my chair and thinking of what to do, I got up and carefully closed the door again. It was just then that I could hear the sound of somebody walking around downstairs in our home. Whoever this was, they were now in the kitchen area. I walked back over to my chair and sat down. To be honest with you, the thought of calling the police didn't even pop into my head at the time. I can't tell you why, but it just didn't, as dumb as that may sound. I was just focused on somehow trying to get out of there. I considered trying to jump from my window or something, but I knew that wouldn't work. For 20 minutes or so, I was stuck in my bedroom, just hoping the person would not come back. Finally, I got up and walked over to the door. I stood there, listening to the person walking around downstairs like before. Eventually, I couldn't hear anything. Now, things were completely silent. I stayed there for 10 more minutes, listening in. When I didn't hear anything else, I decided I was going to make a run for it. I opened the door and ran downstairs, without looking back. When I got down, I went for the front door. I didn't see anybody inside. After leaving the house, I ran for my car and jumped inside. After locking my car doors, I finally felt safe. No more than a minute later, Kevin pulled up behind me. We didn't have a driveway and would park on the street. He got out of his car and started to walk inside. I got out of my car too and told him I was worried the guy might still be there. With Kevin now here though, I wasn't as scared as I had been before. Now I wasn't alone. I decided to go into the house with him. When we both opened the door, we yelled that whoever was inside needed to leave. There was only silence. Slowly, one by one, we turned on each light in the home and searched every room. The place was not very big, so it didn't take long. Soon we found that whoever had been inside was already gone. Nobody was there. I never found out who it was, and I don't think they ever came back either. Nothing had been stolen, either possibly because we were two broke college guys who didn't have anything worth stealing, or because they were there for something else. How he got inside was a pretty easy figure. Most likely it was because Kevin and I were always coming and going, and somebody had forgotten to lock the doors. Obviously, that changed after this experience. This is one I heard happen to a friend of a friend. I don't know if that makes it an urban legend or what, but I thought I would share it here because it's really spooky. It happened to a guy named Yamamoto when he went on a trip to Tohoku. He was part of a small traveling theater group, and they were performing in the area. This is what happened on the first night he got there. Unfortunately, his theater group arrived during the peak tourism season, so pretty much all the chain hotels were booked full. He did manage to find one room in another hotel, but he was told it was the only room available and happened to be in an older building that was still a part of the hotel. He wasn't exactly wild about the idea of not being placed in a modern hotel building, but he didn't have that many options left available to him. After paying for his room for the night, he was guided to it. He said that when he approached that building, he felt as if there was something wrong about it that made him feel very uneasy. Apparently, in his words, there was an oppressive force, which was hard for him to describe. Mr. Yamamoto there was a guy who apparently had never had any spiritual experiences before. He was a complete non-believer and skeptic, but he still felt an ominous vibe that night. If it were me in his shoes, I might have turned around and looked for another place to stay, but he pressed on. He went to see his room for the night. He thought he might have just been feeling a little anxious ahead of his performance, or maybe he could be tired from all the traveling. He checked in and got himself settled, and turned in for the night. Later that night at about 1 a.m. though, he was woken from a dreamless sleep. to a loud banging on his hotel room door. He jumped out of bed to see what was going on. He got to his feet and went to check on the door. He walked over as quietly as he could to check if anyone was there. He called out to whoever was on the other side, "Who's there?" After looking through the peephole, he found that nobody was out there. He said he even opened the door a crack to double check, but again there was no one to be seen. All he could see was the dimly lit hallway and the green lights of the emergency exit signs glowing. He just assumed it was a prankster out there banging on doors and running off. He didn't mind much pranks, but after 1 a.m., that was a little bit much. He did say, though, that he had a weirdly anxious feeling, the same kind he'd felt when he initially laid his eyes on the building. In that moment, he felt a sudden chill run through him. He couldn't bring himself to fall asleep again. He kept looking over at the door and saw the light from the hallway glowing in the little gap beneath it. He focused on that light for a reason unknown to him. At some point, he dropped off to sleep and suddenly began hearing the banging on the door again. Heavy, loud bangs that immediately snapped him awake. He leapt out of bed again. What if it was some kind of emergency or something? He trembled as he approached the door. As he was within touching distance of it, the banging stopped instantly. He put his eyes up to the peephole to see if he could catch anyone running off down the hallway as a prank, but there was not a single soul out there. He didn't want to take his eye away, just in case someone was hiding out of sight or something. He really wanted to find out who had been messing with him. Eventually, his left eye got tired from squinting out the peephole, so he changed it for his right eye. As he did this, he said he felt a terrifying force coming from behind him. Before he had a chance to move or turn to face what was coming his way, he felt his head get slammed against the door. Before he knew it, he dropped down to the ground, and that's where he stayed until morning came. In the morning, he went to the front desk immediately to complain to the man who was there. The man took his complaint and looked a little pale as Mr. Yamamoto revealed the details of the night before. He pressed the hotel staff for an explanation. This guy was apparently a bit of a hothead who was quick to get things escalating. I guess that comes with the territory of being in the acting game, though. Anyway, he wouldn't leave the guy at the front desk alone until he told him about something that happened 6 years ago. Apparently, there was a fire in that building. Most of the guests were able to escape through the fire exits or leave their rooms through the emergency stairs. There was one young woman, though, who checked into the room he stayed in that didn't make it out that night. The fire alarms were blaring in each room and the halls, but for some reason she managed to sleep through them. When she finally woke up and realized that something was wrong, her room was filling with smoke, seeping in through the crack beneath the door. As she crawled to the door to escape, she found she had locked it and put the chain on from the night before. It was too hot for her to touch, and in the end she passed out due to a lack of oxygen. That made Mr. Yamamoto feel pale and really sent shivers coursing through his body. That didn't scare him as much as what he realized a couple of moments later, though. As he thought back on it, he realized the banging sound he had heard had not been coming from outside his room. It had been coming from the inside. He suspects it was likely the residual energy of that young woman's spirit, desperately trying to escape her hotel room even in the afterlife. How sad. This story was told to me by my uncle, and I figured I'd share it. Now, just a fair warning, this story is really dark. This happened when my uncle was about 12 years old, back in 1980. It was in Ottawa. My dad and aunt were all little kids at the time, and had been living in the house my grandfather had built about 5 years prior. The house was a single-story ranch and sat on an acre of land next to a really large stretch of woods. It was a warm summer evening at about 10 p.m. or so. My uncle and dad were in their bedroom with the windows open since it was so warm. Suddenly, they were awoken by the sound of distant screaming coming from the woods. My uncle and dad shot up from their beds and ran to go tell my grandfather. He got up, and my grandmother, aunt, uncle, and dad all followed him outside to the front porch. He used a flashlight and shined it out toward the woods. It was really dark, and he couldn't see anything. That is, except for a very faint orange glow deep in the distance. He went back inside and used the phone in the kitchen. He called some of his buddies to come over. Like a scene right out of a horror movie 18 minutes later, 2 pickup trucks full of guys with shotguns then arrived. My grandfather made my grandmother, my uncle, dad, and aunt wait inside the house while they all went to investigate the woods. My uncle said they were gone for a really long time, and my grandmother had started worrying. At about 1 a.m., the guys finally returned, but they were all really pale and wouldn't say much about what they had seen. When my grandmother asked about what happened, my grandfather made the kids go back to bed. He took her to the garage on the other side of the house to talk to her. He didn't tell my uncle what happened until years later, and it's no wonder that he didn't want to. When they went into the woods after walking deep inside, they found an abandoned campsite with a smoldering fire. There were beer cans and moonshine everywhere. On a nearby tree was a terrifying sight. A naked black man, beaten and hung with a noose, with a KKK flag stitched to his chest. There's more, of course, but I'm going to leave that out. It was truly graphic and disgusting. My grandfather said it was the most horrifying thing he'd ever seen. They immediately turned around and left. He went back in daylight a few days later, but the body had been buried, with another KKK flag being used as the marker. Now, you're probably hoping some sick people were arrested and justice was brought to the family of this person, but unfortunately no. My grandfather never called the sheriff about this. Unfortunately, the Monroe County sheriffs are extremely corrupt, and some of them are even KKK members themselves. Some still are to this day. The sheriff is even part of a well-known biker gang, so no report was ever made. It would have just gotten thrown out, and probably would have put a huge target on the back of my grandfather, as well as his buddies. You won't find the story online, because it was never reported. A lot of people probably don't want this out there, but I just had to share it, so there's some record of it. Just please don't go investigating this in person. It might really piss off some people in those parts. If you ask any of the locals that lived there for a really long time, though, they'll tell you those woods were a well-known hangout for the KKK back in the day. I'm just really glad that time is now over. Back in 2011, I did a week of guest lecturing at UMSL, and since I was still a young maverick back then, I was content to surf the couch of an old friend who happened to be working there after attending the same university. We were all still in our late 20s, so we were holding down jobs and being fairly responsible, but still staying up until 3 a.m. on the weekend, playing stoned Wii Sports until we got hungry enough to want to eat. At that point, we'd head on over to the local 24-hour Walmart to grab whatever looked good. He worked late shifts, and all my lectures were scheduled for the afternoon, so we stayed up almost every night either just hanging out, watching movies, or playing the Wii. On the 4th night of our little ritual, my buddy got home from work. We smoked up, played some more Wii Sports, and made our way over to the Walmart to grab some food. We were walking up and down the aisles with a basket, throwing in pizzas and wings and whatever you can think of. When we got to the snack aisle, we found ourselves in a minor disagreement over which chips to buy. We basically ended up standing there, having some dog-brained debate on which Ruffles were the superior flavor. That was when I started to notice this strange guy at the end of the aisle on our right. I noticed him because he wasn't looking at any of the merchandise. He was looking directly at us. You know, when you can see someone looking in your direction, but you don't want to make eye contact with them, so you kinda just check them out in your peripheral vision, but refrain from meeting their gaze. It sounds oddly specific, I know, but I'm sure some of you will know what I mean when I say I did not look directly at this dude. I could tell for certain he was looking at us, though. Not just a simple glance either. He was hardcore staring. I turned to my buddy and was about to say let's get out of here when I saw a second man standing at the opposite end. He was doing the exact same thing. I did end up making eye contact with the second guy, purely by accident. He only glanced at me for a second before I realized he wasn't looking strictly at me. He was looking past me at the first guy. That's when I turned back to the original man to see if he was really checking out this other guy and not me and my buddy. Lo and behold, he was looking at this seemingly random dude. Keep in mind that I was completely toasted at this time, so it took me a second to realize what was going on. There weren't just these two random dudes staring at me from each end of the aisle. They were having some weird silent confrontation. At first, I didn't realize just what that meant, but the second the guy on my right reached for his waistband, and I saw a flash of black against his bright red boxers, everything started to slow down and hit me all at once. I remember dragging my buddy to the floor, as all of a sudden shots began to pop off around us. I instinctively tucked my head in and squeezed my eyes shut. Because of that, I didn't see anything of what happened next. All I could hear was a flurry of shots, more specifically, the crazy echoing they made as the sound waves bounced all over the store, while the shots continued ringing out as the gun battle ensued. I had my buddy in my left ear screaming "what the fuck" over and over. We just laid there until everything finally went quiet. My ears were ringing, and at that point my buddy had gone quiet too. Probably one of the most terrifying moments of my entire life right there. I thought my best friend in the entire world had just been shot dead. Thankfully, he had just finally decided to shut up and be quiet. But that moment of thinking, "Oh God, please no," was one of the worst ones in my entire life. I remember helping my friend up, and we saw one of the employees running for a fire exit. We followed. Next thing I knew, we were in the parking lot, hearing one siren turn into two, and then doubling again. Before we knew it, there were a half-dozen cop cars all pulling into that Walmart parking lot. It was completely filled with red and blue lights as the cops began to swarm into the Walmart through the front entrance. By that point, both shooters were long gone, though. I don't remember seeing any blood. I mean, not that we were looking. I'm not sure they even actually hit each other. I read later that you don't start gushing blood after being shot. Sometimes it takes a second for the bleeding to really kick in, depending on where the wound is. Maybe they did hit each other, and I just didn't see any of it. I actually did a disturbing amount of research into small caliber shootouts after that whole incident. It was all under the recommendation of the therapists I'd been provided. They were really great, providing me with paid leave as well. I'm not going to lie, being in public places was pretty nerve-wracking for a while after. The thing that really got me was how lucky we'd been not to have been hit in the crossfire. I'll put it this way, we had to talk to the cops afterward to give them a description of both shooters. We got a pretty good breakdown on what actually happened. I guess these two gangbangers managed to pepper the entire aisle with bullets that somehow went everywhere, but by the grace of God, neither of us had been hit. It's still something I think about from time to time. Whenever I drive past Walmart someplace, it's guaranteed to pop into my head. If I ever have to visit one for any reason, I always wonder what might happen. I don't know what might have happened if I hadn't spotted the guns in time, or if we hadn't been so lucky in regard to where the bullets ended up. I go to Target all the time. It's the main place where I do most of my shopping. The store has just about everything you could want, from groceries to electronics. It's also nicer, in my opinion, than competitors like Walmart and Costco. Anyway, this is something that happened last year. It caused me to not go there for quite a while. It happened one night when I went to do my normal grocery shopping. I think I got to the Target a little bit later than I usually do. It was maybe around 8 o'clock at night or so when I got inside. I grabbed a cart and started walking around the store, grabbing the various things I needed. At one point, I remember I was toward the back corner, and that's when I first noticed a woman. This woman was sort of short, thin, and had long, messy hair. What stood out about her the most was that she was just standing in the exact corner of the store and staring at me. She didn't have a shopping cart or basket, and wasn't holding anything either. It just seemed really odd. I was getting something back there about 30 feet away from her. I spent maybe a minute in the area, and when I was leaving, I walked sort of past her. I glanced over and noticed she was still staring at me. This was really, really weird. I mean, she hadn't really moved at all. What was she even doing? As I walked away, I could feel her still staring at me. I certainly did not recognize this woman at all. I moved on to another section in the grocery department from there, and I continued my shopping. Probably 10 minutes or so went by when I noticed her again. I was in an aisle and there were a few other people scattered around here and there. I noticed that a ways behind me was the very same woman. I didn't really look at her to see if she was staring at me again or not. I just noticed that she was there. I kept shopping like normal and was soon in another aisle. I saw the woman there as well. This was getting pretty weird. I still tried to ignore it though and not let it bother me. Soon I was done shopping. I then walked to the front of the store toward the checkout aisle. When I was walking there and in a more open area now, I noticed the woman was definitely trailing me. She was remaining a sort of far way behind me, but she was certainly following me. I really didn't know what to make of this. I got in line and waited to check out. As I did, the woman did not get in line behind me, but instead stood just inside the clothing section, which was adjacent to the checkout area. I was able to pay for my items and then be on my way. I walked out of the store, not bothering to look around and see if the woman was still following me. I didn't notice her at all until I had made it to my vehicle. I got into my car, which was a smaller SUV, and opened up the back rear door. I put several grocery bags inside of it, and that's when I saw the woman again. This time she was just standing in an empty parking space, which was across and one over from my vehicle. She was once more about 30 feet away or so. I thought for just one brief second about talking to her. I was curious as to why she was acting so strangely. I decided not to, though. I didn't know what she was capable of. I finished unloading the things and closed up my trunk. I walked around to my driver's door and climbed inside. To my surprise, I heard the rear hatch suddenly open. I looked back and saw the woman literally climbing over my groceries into the back seat of my SUV. I asked her what the hell she was doing. At that point, she started climbing over the rear seats of my car, heading straight for me. It was a terrifying moment when that happened. I decided to leave my car again. I had no idea what she was planning to do, so I took my keys out of the ignition and jumped out of my driver's door. I basically sprinted full speed back inside of Target. The woman did not leave my car and chase out after me. When I was safely inside, I called the police and reported the incident to them. I waited inside Target without seeing the woman at all. When they got there about 10 minutes later, I spoke with them briefly. They went to my car to look for the woman. She had left my vehicle, but was a short distance away trying to break into another one. After the police apprehended her, I went back and looked at my car. Overall, it was fine, but she had taken all of my groceries out the bag and opened up several things. It was really weird. This incident caused me not to go to Target for a while, but I've since returned. I really don't know what the woman's problem with me was. I had a really strange experience during high school. It's so strange that I don't think anyone I've told actually believes me. They just kind of nod and listen along, but I can assure you, it's 100% true. Of course, it's entirely up to you what you want to believe, though. It happened during autumn. My second year of high school was kind of unique. They didn't put much interest into school festivals at all. They had a very heavy focus on sports and cheerleading clubs. Every class was expected to show their spirit for our teams and help out with all the sporting events. My class decided to make a large signboard that we would position behind the cheerleaders. So, along with a couple of my closer friends in the group, we formed a party to go out and find some wood. Well, to a bunch of teenage boys, wood isn't exactly hard to come by, but it's expensive wood from a tree. I mean lumber, of course. We decided to go with bamboo to build the structure, because that's abundantly available here in Japan. One kid in my class said his family owned some land where we could find some bamboo. Now, I was expecting some small plot of land, but this kid's family land included a mountain. Me and a couple of other boys went with him to his family mountain on a Saturday afternoon to cut down some bamboo. There were 5 of us in total. Thankfully, the bamboo thicket was just at the lower part of the mountain. There was a woodland trail which wasn't paved in the middle of that thicket of bamboo, which led further up the mountain. I would say the mountain was about 100 meters high. We found some suitable bamboo that would be strong enough to support the sign our class was making. We set about cutting it down, but as we were cutting it, we were disturbed by a very strange noise that seemed to be emanating from far away down the mountain path. It wasn't a human voice making that noise. It didn't even sound like an animal, really. It sounded like some kind of strange metallic mechanical sound. I don't really know how to describe it. I thought it may have been an electric saw of some kind. The kid whose land it was said there would be no one else up there with us on the mountain today, though. His parents had made sure we would be alone so that we would be safe. I'll do my best to explain this sound. First of all, it wasn't like an engine sound, but a different sort of machine. I don't really know how to say it. Not much like a machine that cuts down trees. More like a machine that uses gears to move things back and forth or something. I don't know. It wasn't the kind of machinery you'd expect to hear in the mountains. The 5 of us put down our tools and looked at each other as this metallic noise screeched out again. I got to my feet and decided to go in search of that noise. Probably a really dumb move, but I was a high school kid. I certainly wouldn't do it again at this age, though. I'm 25 now, by the way. Anyway, I stuttered along the woodland path with my classmates following along behind me. They were probably just as interested as I was. As we went further along the trail, we heard the same noise again. This time, the noise was coming a little bit off to the right of the trail, from a dense grove of trees. We headed off the beaten path and out into the woods. There were various rocky outcrops here. The landowner kid stopped and pointed at something in silence. I followed the direction of his finger with my eyes, and I was shocked to see a door. There was a door attached to one of these rocky outcroppings. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like someone had built a secret base out here, but this couldn't just be the work of some kids or some homeless person. This was an impressive door. It was made of pure metal and didn't have a handle. I didn't know how it could be opened or closed. This strange door in the middle of the woods was a hell of a sight, especially when that metal was the only non-natural thing in the vicinity, the only man-made thing out here. The door was actually partly open, and we could see darkness spilling out of it. I couldn't make out what was in there, but it looked like some kind of large passageway. I turned to the landowner kid. "Hey, what's with this door here? I have no clue. I had no idea this was here." He took a couple of steps closer and kept saying over and over he had no clue what this was. He turned back to us. "Hey, why don't we look inside?" As soon as he said that, all I could think of was how horrible it would be if the door suddenly closed when we were all inside. We would be trapped in there. We needed to take measures of precaution, so I suggested we find a big rock or something to wedge the door open. Only 3 of us wanted to go in out of the 5. The others were too scared. We found a rock big enough to hold the door open, and I asked the other 2 to stand on guard for us and yell if something happened. With the rock in place, the 3 of us headed in. My heart was beating in my chest. I was filled with a mix of excitement and fear. It was pitch black inside, made it difficult to see what was directly in front of us. Since us 3 were secret smokers, we all whipped out our Zippo lighters. I headed the expedition into the tunnel, with my 2 other friends to my left and right, making a sort of triangle formation. I touched the walls of the passage at one point, and they felt like they were made of rock, like the mountain had been carved out. It was very clear to me this was not a natural occurrence in nature. This passageway had been created by some kind of machinery. It was wide enough for a couple people to pass through. It was making me a little claustrophobic. The fear began to outweigh the excitement. I'd say we'd gone about 10 meters into the passageway, when at that point it opened up into a wider area. There was nothing in this room area though, no signs of life, just an empty space. We couldn't see where the wall ended. We talked about it briefly with one another, and were considering whether to keep exploring or head back out. Our friends outside made up our minds for us. Their voices echoed into the passageway as they shouted for us to come back. They sounded panicked and frightened, and were really worked up. They were screaming themselves hoarse. Something had seriously scared them, and thus scared us 3. Panic came like a wave and washed over us. We all freaked out and ran for it. We needed to get out of that passageway. We hurried back toward the doorway. To our utter disbelief, the door was moving on its own. The rock alone wasn't enough to hold the door open. The 2 others were holding it back best as they could, but it seemed too strong even for them. We sprinted to the exit, and I saw they were losing their battle with the door. I was at the back on the way out, since I had been the first in. I watched as the first kid I was with got out and joined the others in holding the door open. The second kid helped when he got out as well. If they hadn't done that with their quick thinking, I would have likely been trapped in that passageway. I made it out just in the nick of time, as the door closed behind me. As everyone let go, I moved away from the door. It made that mechanical sound we had heard earlier. The rock we had wedged it open with cracked and rolled down the passageway into the dark before the door slammed shut. It was clear to us now that the sound we'd heard before was the door opening and closing. According to one of the kids who'd waited outside for us, the door had suddenly started closing on its own without any warning. That's when they grabbed it. Had they not done that, and had us 3 in the passageway been a little slower, we would have been trapped in there. I couldn't help but imagine the image of a Venus flytrap. When that realization came to me, we tried to calm ourselves down. It was getting a little dark out now, so we made plans to go back and investigate the following day. We came back and tried to retrace our footsteps, but we couldn't find that doorway anywhere, or the passage. It was almost like it never even existed. None of us could believe that it was gone without a trace. I've kept in touch with the landowner, and I check in with him every now and then. He says that he never saw that metal door or heard those strange mechanical sounds again. And that's the weirdest thing that ever happened to me, and I can't help but feel as if we avoided some horrible fate that day. Before I begin this story, I just want to say in advance to all those that are supportive through this post that I greatly appreciate it. I do not condone violence, and I do not support sending your kid to school with guns, although I'm glad my dad didn't see it that way at the time. For those of you who don't believe me, I don't blame you. Everyone lies on the internet, and it's always good to be a skeptic. It's been 15 years. And it's definitely brought back some more emotions than I've been wanting to admit. I grew up in a DC suburb. We rarely have crime, and when we do, it's typically a crime of abundance. Kids getting busted with coke, drunk driving, graffiti to look cool. You get the picture. I always considered it a super safe place until my life changed in an instant. My parents are immigrants, and I'm first gen. I speak the language of my parents' fatherland, and both my parents are naturalized citizens. Essentially, my family did everything to fit into America, and they were able to achieve economic success in their own right. Behind my house was a park, where I played basketball pretty much every day since I was 6 years old. Every now and then, we'd get some kids not from the neighborhood. I was friends with most of them, and there were never any problems. One day, a Spanish kid came and played with us. He insisted that my friend had fouled him, and they got into a big shouting match. All of a sudden, the kid pulled out a knife. I was one of the few kids on my block who had a cell phone, so I instantly dialed 911. In the posh DC suburbs, cops responded to deadly weapon calls instantly. Not even 2 minutes later, the cops were already in the parking lot, and this kid was getting arrested. The entire time he was screaming at the top of his lungs that I was a dead man and he was going to kill me. Being the macho high school freshman that I was, I laughed at him, along with everybody else on the court. He was hauled off to wherever they take minor offenders. Little did I know that his older brother was in MS-3, one of the most dangerous and notorious Latin gangs in America. 2 weeks later, my father came home from work to find a dead rat nailed to our door, with a note written in Spanish saying, "You're next." We called the police, but essentially they said there wasn't much they could do. To be safe, drive your son to school, and so forth. And that's what the cops told my dad. I was essentially on my own. My father, having served in the armed forces in his native country for over 7 years, had his own idea of protection. We had spent the next 2 weeks at the range, where my dad made sure I could hit a pinhole with his old service-issued HKP-9S. He then made me carry it in my backpack, even to school, where I could have been expelled and arrested. Then it happened. My dad couldn't pick me up from school one day. It was about a month later. I rode the bus. I knew one of this kid's buddies was on the bus, who had an early stop. The police later discovered he called the kid to let him know I was riding the bus that very day. By the time I got off the stop and rounded the corner, 3 guys were waiting for me. The other kid, his brother, and another MS-13 or tatted up guy. I was a few blocks away from my house, so I bolted and they chased me. They cornered me in my backyard before I could get to the door. The 2 older guys took out their switchblades and told me in broken English not to fight, that it would hurt less if I didn't fight back. At this point, I literally pissed myself. I had never felt such fear. They laughed and started walking toward me. In that moment, I reached into my backpack and pulled out my dad's gun. I flipped the safety and fired at the kid's older brother's chest. He hit the ground instantly. The other 2 were frozen, but the kid charged at me. Although he had no identifiable weapon on him, I didn't hesitate. I turned my sights on him and shot him 2 times point blank. I turned to the last thug who hadn't moved an inch the entire time, but was still brandishing the knife. I proceeded to unload the remainder of my magazine into him. By that point, our neighbor, who was a lieutenant in the police force, came outside. He was naked after just coming out of the shower. He had his service arm in hand. He came to find me sitting on the grass in my own urine, crying while all 3 teens bled out around me. The remainder was a blur. My interrogation didn't last long at all. The 2 older ones were illegal immigrants with assault priors and had weapons on them. And the question came down to whether or not it was self-defense when I shot the kid who charged me. The younger brother. They determined that he tried to incapacitate me while the other man was still armed, and so it was an act of self-defense because my life was still in danger. The neighbor lieutenant claimed the younger brother had reached into his pants for a weapon. That was a lie. He hadn't done that, but the lieutenant lied to protect me. I wasn't even detained for longer than a few hours. My family moved soon after. Luckily, we had the means to do so. I got sent to a private school in a different state, which ended up being a really great experience for me. Keep in mind I was 14 when this happened. I'm in my late 20s now, and I don't regret anything. My parents sent me to counseling, but even the counselor said I was relatively stable. All things considered, I'm not a violent person, nor do I hold any prejudice against Latinos at all. I am a little paranoid though, and I have a concealed carry permit now. I'm wildly socially liberal, but I will not hesitate to defend my Second Amendment rights. At the time of the story, I was 21 and living in a major Midwestern city near the university there. Having lived there for only 1 month before my story began, I had witnessed a train stop stabbing, been yelled at by a crackhead, had a homeless guy follow me and threaten to choke me outside the physics building on campus, and watched a 13-car cop raid on a drug house just across the street. The area around the university was known for being rough and had a notoriously high rate of crime. We would get a few texts a week from the campus police, saying things like there had been a robbery or a break-in, an assault, a stalking, an attempted kidnapping, etc. I always ignored these texts, thinking foolishly that I would never be a victim. I was smart enough to stay out of trouble, not go out alone late at night, and all of those cliches. I seriously regret that behavior now, and to anyone listening to this, please never think you're 100% safe, no matter your level of preparedness. Always do your best to stay observant and be careful. The first incident wasn't too unusual. I was just a block or 2 away from my apartment building. It was in the early evening. It was still light outside. I was walking my dog Sesame, a cute Shiba Inu who looks like a fluffy, goofy puppy and has never been frightening or particularly protective in his life. As I was heading back home, I passed a small parking lot, and in it was a large van. I could see a man in his early 60s, sitting in the driver's seat smoking a cigarette. He stared at me as I passed by, and actually leaned out of his car and called out to me, "Hey, you there! That's a cute dog. What's its name?" I should mention this isn't even my first story like this. I have a pretty intense fear of strangers, and actually struggle with PTSD from other incidents in my life. Being pretty wary, I decided to ignore him, and just walked faster. I heard a car door shut behind me, and turned around to see that he'd gotten out of his van, and was making his way toward me. He called out to me again, "Hey, baby, I just want to see your dog. Come back here." His phrasing pissed me off. I gripped my dog's leash and started to speed walk away from him. I was starting to feel nervous. My heart was beginning to pound, but I kept telling myself over and over that I was overreacting. It was just my paranoia acting up. It was nothing to worry about. Boy, was I wrong. I managed to turn the corner and was about to cross the final park before getting to my apartment. And my fear over the van guy. I wasn't paying as much attention as I usually do to what's in front of me. I looked back over my shoulder, and the guy had stopped following me. He was standing in the middle of the sidewalk with a big creepy grin on his face. I whirled back around, with my eyes glued to the building. I only needed to walk another half a block, and I'd be home then. I was going to get away from him and his creepy van. Just when I thought I was safe, though, a group of 5 or 6 men emerged from the side of the park I wasn't watching. They were all tall and intimidating in stature, and all of them were laughing and looking right at me. Out of the corner of my eye, the van guy started moving toward me as well. I remember he was whistling. I again picked up my pace and desperately searched for my keys in my pockets as I hurried to the door. The group of men then veered toward me, partially cutting me off. In all my stupid politeness, I stopped. They grinned at me with sick, perverted smiles, obviously checking me out, looking up and down my body. It made me feel sick. I tried not to panic and inched closer to my apartment. "Hey, what's your name? Where you going? What's your Snapchat? Is this your apartment? Can we come over?" They all barraged me with questions, one after another. I tried to refuse them. I saw the van guy come and join their group, leering at me while I inched away. They moved closer, and one of them reached out for me, his fingers actually touching my arm. I leapt back, trying not to start crying. All of a sudden, Sesame lunged at them with his teeth bared and a horrifying snarl ripping from his throat. Every bit of his cute Shiba personality was completely gone, and he looked like he wanted to tear these guys' throats out. It startled them enough that I was able to turn around and sprint the final distance to my building, locking the door behind me. I fell to the floor inside, hugging Sesame. The entire front of my building, however, was made of glass, and to my horror and disbelief, a group of men came and stood in front of the windows, grinning at me, laughing and making kissing faces and lewd gestures. The apartment manager came out and called the cops on them, but they ran away. I made it back home and scrubbed myself in the shower, crying and shaking with fear. Sesame got a special dinner that night, and I kept telling myself they just wanted to mess with me. I was never in any real danger. Stupid of me, I know. About a month later, when I finally managed to be able to walk outside my apartment without severe anxiety, I actually planned on moving a bit further away from campus. I was still going to be in the sketchy neighborhood, but the thought of those men knowing where I lived kept me up at night. My apartment actually hired a security guard to be there 24/7 after someone had broken into the building, smashed all the windows, destroyed some of the furniture, and stolen a bunch of bikes. Of course, my bike had gotten stolen as well. Anyway, I was heading home from class. It was a beautiful day, and I felt pretty happy for once. I put my earbuds in on the last few blocks before I got home. After a block or so, I started to feel like someone was watching me, though. My palms started sweating, and I glanced behind me, trying not to look obvious. A tall man was 20 feet behind me, staring straight at my head. I snapped my head back around and ripped out my earbuds. No, I thought. It can't be one of them. I was just jumping to conclusions, giving my anxiety disorder and paranoia fuel. There was something familiar about him, though. My heart started racing, as I hoped to God the others weren't waiting for me around the corner of my building, ready to ambush me. I walked faster, wishing Sesame was with me. I was too afraid to look back at the man as I fumbled with my keys and wrenched the door open as hard as I could. This turned out to be a crucial mistake. I ran to the elevator, trying to breathe a sigh of relief, but when I looked back, I saw with absolute horror that the man had managed to catch the door and had thrown it wide open. He was slowly coming into the building with me. He paused, standing away from me but close enough that I could hear his ragged breath and the smell of alcohol coming off him. My heart was thudding in my chest now. I struggled to think clearly. The apartment manager was already home for the day, and I was completely alone in the lobby. There were no other doors out of that room, and the stranger was blocking my way. The security guard, who was supposed to be keeping an eye on the building, was nowhere to be seen. The elevator came and I tried to run into it and slammed my hand over the door close button as fast as I could. I pushed my floor button and huddled in the far corner of the elevator. I started to once again try to catch my breath, but right when the door was almost closed, he stuck his hand in. I couldn't believe it. He waited until the door was just about to close, and then he stopped it. He was standing close enough that there was no way that was a mistake. My stomach dropped, and a suffocating sense of dread crept in. I kept my head down as he joined me. My desperate hope was that he was just a dirty, drunken resident of the building. That was dashed when he didn't press any buttons. I don't know why I didn't run out of the elevator or try to leave the building again. I was paralyzed with fear, and all I could do was watch as the door closed and sealed my fate. The elevator was filled with a stench of alcohol. If I wasn't so terrified, I may have gagged. It was nauseating. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't even move. I screamed at myself in my head to press the wrong button and tried to escape him, but I was petrified. He leaned over me, and I heard him breathe in deeply and quietly sigh. I felt tears well up in my eyes. The seconds it took to reach the top floor where I lived felt like hours. I saw no way I could escape this drunk guy who was smelling me. In the reflection of the elevator walls, I could make out his disgusting smile. He was staring directly at me, his hands in his pockets, clearly holding on to something. I'm not religious, but I prayed I could make it to my door in time. I realized he probably was not going to attack me in the elevator. There was a large camera in the ceiling. I looked up at it, feeling tears spill out of my eyes. As I did so, I hoped that whoever saw the tape later would eventually identify this man. The worst part of this all was that I've trained in martial arts and self-defense since I was about 8 years old. I thought myself as braver and stronger than I was acting. I should know what to do. I should be strong enough to do it. But no matter how many times I had disarmed, thrown, or choked out attackers in the studio, nothing prepares you for the dread of a real-life situation. As the elevator reached my floor, I managed to snap out of my stupor long enough to dash out the door and run to my apartment unit. I nearly missed the keyhole, but threw the door open. I was nearly through when my backpack snagged on the handle of the door. I heard the man running over, a little bit of a chuckle building in his throat as he watched me panic and struggle to get free. Eventually I gave up and shoved my arms through the straps, abandoning my backpack. As I did so, the man suddenly reached out for me. I was able to slam the door shut and deadbolt it. The gust of the air from the door slamming brought his disgusting smell in with me. I looked through the peephole. There he was, staring right at it, pressing his forehead against the door. His mouth was in a furious scowl. He swore at me and ripped my backpack off the handle of the door. He slammed it to the ground. I winced as I heard my laptop thud. I was still too terrified to say anything. I grabbed the knife I kept by my door, ready in my hand if he tried anything further. After a few minutes of staring at my door and jiggling the handle, plus licking the peephole, and I'm not joking when I say that, he unzipped the backpack, dumping all its contents out onto the floor. He picked up my bag and began sniffing it, leering at the peephole as he did so, like he knew I was still watching him. Finally, he left using the elevator, visible from the door, like nothing had ever happened. I continued to stare out for what felt like an eternity. Then I finally called the apartment manager, feeling my anger sinking in. The security guard had not been anywhere in sight, not paying attention at all. It turns out he had fallen asleep eating Taco Bell and watching movies on his phone. He was only 10 feet away from the elevator the entire time, sleeping in the office behind a closed door. They fired him, but the creepy guy was never caught, and neither were any of the others. I don't know for sure this man was even part of the original group. I was honestly too terrified to look much at their faces during the initial incident. I moved out of my apartment a week later, staying with my boyfriend at the time for the remainder of my lease. I kept Sesame with me at all times when possible. A few more things happened while I lived in that city, from having to call in a gunfight outside my new apartment window to having to pick up my friend who was being followed by a van. There are nice things about that city too, but during my time there, besides learning the police department was absolutely useless and corrupt, I had to escape with my life multiple times. I couldn't be happier to be far, far away from there and doing a lot better with my fear and anxiety.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and that little notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you have your own encounter you'd like to share, leave a comment below. Who knows, it might just find its way into a future video. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the scariest stories are often the ones closest to home.